Good morning, everyone. We are going to discuss the introduction to environmental science. Now, I already gave to you your task. It is actually the outline for this topic. For this session, we are going to discuss in details all the general concepts on environmental science. By the way, this PowerPoint presentation was downloaded from Our Room Science under the area of environmental science. I hope you're going to listen and take down all the important notes for this subject. Of course, to begin our discussion, let us first define environmental science. Environmental science is the study of the interaction of humans and or with the natural environment. The environment includes all the living or the biotic and non-living things, the abiotic, that we interact with. So the interaction happens between the human and the non-human. So we, as human beings, we interact with our natural environment. That includes climate, what else? Soil and landforms, water sources or bodies of water, and also to other living organisms like animals, plants, and microorganisms such as bacteria, um, fungi. Those are other living organisms we interact with. Environmental science and the issues that it studies are complex and interdisciplinary. Anong ibig sabihin po natin ng interdisciplinary? It means that it incorporates concepts and ideas from multiple fields of science. So si environmental science are complex and interdisciplinary. So matatap din natin sa environmental science yung other branches or division of sciences like itong nandito sa ating uh, the tree of science. Nandyan ang chemistry, nandyan ang meteorology, zoology, bacteriology, anthropology, paleontology, physiology, physics, math, astronomy, geology, geography, and botany. So, environmental science can interact with other sciences. Let's have a short um, history of environmental science. Humans have impacted the Earth since the very beginnings of civilization. In 2400 BC, the agricultural fields of Sumeria had grain production similar to modern agriculture, about 30 bushels per acre. So tingnan nyo yung agricultural endeavor ng mga taga Sumeria. Sumeria are considered to be one of the old civilization in the history of human being. The Sumerians relied on irrigation, the artificial application of water from another source. So that is an application of science, right? The irrigation. Kasi artificial na yon. It does not came from the natural bodies of water, but an artificial application of water from another source. Tigris and Euphrates rivers, yan ang sources of water para mag-flow doon sa irrigation to supply the water demand of their agricultural land. So, as you can see, this is an image of the Tigris River, Diyarbakir in Turkey. All water, small amount, All water contains small amounts of minerals called salt, and that salt built up in the Mesopotamian soil over time. Yields declined to half, then a fourth within a few hundred years. So bumaba ang kanilang harvest. By the 7th century AD, slave labor had to be used to strip the upper salt layer from the soil so it could still be farmed. So tingnan nyo ang naging interaction ng human beings sa environment. So ano yung environment natin dito? In our example, we are looking on to dito sa Tigris River and yung Mesopotamian soil na na-create. Nung mag-decline daw to half yung kanilang production, nagkaroon ng slave labor and they used had to be used to strip the upper salt layer from the soil so it could still be farmed. So para madagdagan yung agricultural land na gagamitin for agricultural purposes. By the 16th century, the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia was a salty wasteland. So tingnan nyo ang nangyari. Because of the exploitation of human doon sa area ng Mesopotamian soil, yung fertile crescent, supposed to be fertile, became a salty wasteland. So, ano po yan? From history, nakikita na natin kung paano mag-consume or mag-interact ang tao sa kaniyang environment. This is an example of two important concepts in environmental science, yung binigay nating example. Ano yon? The law of unintended consequences, which states that the actions of people and government always have unexpected effects. That is called the law of unintended consequences. Unsustainability. Ito pa yung isa pang concept based doon sa nakita nating example from history. A condition that cannot continue at its current rate, meaning unsustainable. Kasi cannot continue at its current rate. Naging unsustainable siya. Now we have also here the tragedy of the commons. An ecologist named Garrett Hardin wrote an essay called The Tragedy of the Commons, describing a major source of environmental conflict. Ano yung conflict? Commons, since this is the tragedy of commons, ano yung commons na tinutukoy? Commons or areas that are shared and not owned are likely to be depleted as individuals pursue their own self-interest. Okay? Take note that these common na tinutukoy are the areas that are shared and not owned. So, most likely, anong mangyayari? To be depleted as individuals, yung pwedeng mag-share doon kasi wala namang nagmamay-ari, di ba? So, as individuals, pursue their own self-interest. Okay. For example, tingnan niyo po ito. This is parang a pasture, tingnan niyo po. Paano natin dito i-apply yung tragedy of commons? Two small villages consist mostly of farmers that raise and sell sheep at nearby city. The first village, ito, kung nakikita ninyo sa screen yung first village, itong una, has common pasture that all villages have unrestricted access to. So meaning, everybody can enjoy the pasture or they have the right to share on this pasture. So, kasi nga unrestricted access. So, anybody can own, kumbaga. The second village, however, itong sa baba, has a pasture that has been divided up, which each section owned by a farmer. na-divide siya, tapos yung each section or each division owned by a farmer. So ano ang most likely na consequences nitong dalawang pasture? Yung isa na open to all, unrestricted, pwedeng ma-access ng lahat. Tapos dito naman sa isang pasture na naka-divide, tapos sa bawat section may nagmamay-ari pa. Ano kaya ang pwedeng consequences nitong dalawa? Which village will be more likely to experience resource depletion, where a resource is consumed faster than it can be replaced? Kasi nagkakaroon tayo ng depletion kasi nako-consume bago pa mapalitan. At meron pa nga na-consume pero hindi napalitan. So most likely, meron talagang depletion or pagkaubos. Sige, ano kaya yung magiging sagot niyo diyan? So most likely, saan kaya unang mauubos? Sa una, dito sa taas, yung first pasture na nakita natin? O yung pangalawa? Okay. Kayo ang bahalang mag-analyze niyan, pero magbibigay pa ako ng isa pang example. Ito, sabi dito, climate change, air pollution, water pollution, and overfishing of international waters are all modern examples of the tragedy of commons. Kung mapapansin nyo, walang nagmamay-ari sa climate, right? It is, kumbaga, natural. Our air is also natural. Without it, we cannot thrive, cannot survive. Water, wala nang nagmamay-ari. Wala namang magsasabi na sa akin ang Pacific Ocean, sa akin ang Indian Ocean. Wala naman siguro tayong kilala na nagmamay-ari nun. Kumbaga, international water siya. Unless sakop siya nung meron tayong tinatawag na kumbaga, ano man tawag natin dun, yung area of responsibility ng bawat bansa. Kaya merong kumbaga area lang na masasakop mo na it is said to be na owned by a specific country. Halimbawa sa atin sa Pilipinas, 'di ba may pinag-aagawan na, alin ba yun, yung Scarborough Shoal ata yun. 'Di ba inaangkin yon ng China? But it is very obvious na yun ay sa Pilipinas talaga. Kasi sakop yun ng yung parang measurement na sa atin talaga yun. Kaya lang inaangkin ng China since nakikita nila na meron doong resource na pwedeng pagkakitaan. Okay, so yun, meron naman tayong kumbaga limit doon sa property natin sa isang bodies of water. Pero with regard sa international water, yung Pacific Ocean, ganun kalawak, wala namang isang tao lang na magmamay-ari nun. Kaya nga, sabi dito, climate change, air pollution, water pollution, and overfishing of international waters are all modern of the tragedy of the commons. Bakit? Wala ngang nagmamay-ari. So everybody can share. Everybody can get sources or resources from it. So ano ang mangyayari? Dahil open ang karagatan sa lahat ng tao, nagkakaroon ng overfishing. Ang air pollution naman, since ang air naman is hindi naman palaging hindi visible, hindi mo naman agad mame-measure na ito is, the pollution I am, releasing is just enough for the location I am into. Meron na tayo ngayong limitation of carbon footprint. Pero ngayon na lang 'yan na na na-e-experience na natin ang ang problem, yung air pollution nga, yung global warming na tinatawag, okey? Kaya nagkaroon nun kasi dati wala tayong pakialam, yung mga tao walang pakialam kung gaano kataas ng carbon footprints ang nare-release sa environment. O kaya nagkakaroon tayo ng tragedy of the commons. Again, ulitin natin kung anong ibig sabihin nun. Commons are the areas that are shared and not owned. And because of that, most likely it will be depleted. Why? For what reason? Of course, mainly for individuals' uh, self-interest. Kaya dito sa example natin na dalawang pasture, siguro alam nyo na ngayon sagutin kung alin dyan ang unang mauubos. Compare nyo na lang na yung unang pasture, yan yung international water. So anong pwedeng mangyari doon? Pwedeng magkaroon ng over-harvesting, overkilling, ano pa, kung over consumption ng pangunguha ng milk sa mga sheep, kung gano'n, pwedeng gano'n. So, since ano siya, open to all. Unlike doon sa pangalawang pasture na naka-section tapos may nagmamay-ari pa. So, kung makonsume man, most probably ay papalitan. Okay. Now, we move on to the progressive era. In the US or in the United States, the first environmental movement began with a series of conservation measures taken by President Teddy Roosevelt. The goal was to prevent the resource depletion and the destruction of commons through unsustainable logging and hunting. So, based doon sa tragedy of commons, yun ang gustong ma-address ni President Teddy Roosevelt. So, this is the first environmental movement. So, noon pa man, ah, thank God kasi meron pa ding mga tao na really are concerned to our environment. Like President Teddy Roosevelt. So ano ang goal niya? To prevent the resource depletion and the destruction of commons. Yung commons na tinutukoy, yung area na kumbaga prone for over harvesting. Okay? And through unsustainable logging and hunting. Tingnan niyo itong example. Redwood Lumberjacks, Humboldt County in California. Tingnan niyo kung gaano kalalaki ang mga puno na pinuputo lang. Bakit? Kasi dati walang restriction, kahit sino pwedeng magputol niyan. Pero dahil sa conservation measures na ginawa or pinatupad ni President Roosevelt, nagkaroon na ng restriction o bawal tong putulin. Kasi tingnan niyo yung ganyang kalalaking puno, ibig sabihin ay napakatagal na niyan na nabuhay. At marami na ang nakadepende diyan na mga organisms. National parks are preserved areas that are relatively unaltered from their original states. Okay, national parks. No fishing, no logging, commercial hunting, or livestock grazing can occur. That is national park. Okay? Meron ba kayong naiisip na example ng national park dito sa atin? Di ba meron tayo? The Bulusan National Park. Anong basta yung sa Bulusan, Bulusan Volcano National Park, 'yon. Hindi siya bawal doon mag-illegal logging kasi meron doong environmental measures kasi preserve area po siya. So isang example po 'yun ng national park wherein walang puwedeng mangyaring fishing, overfishing lalo na, logging, commercial hunting, or livestock grazing. Walang puwedeng mangyari do'n. Nagiging ano nagiging ano nga siya, parang area of study kasi pinag-aaralan kung ano yung mga existing na organisms, the flora and fauna present in our, Bulusan Park. National forests are federally managed but do allow commercial logging and recreational hunting and fishing. Oh, tingnan niyo naman sa national forest, are federally managed but do allow commercial logging and recreational hunting and fishing. So meron naman dito pero may limitation pa din 'yan. National Wildlife Refuge do not allow commercial activities but may allow recreational hunting and fishing. So ito naman sa National Wildlife Refuge. Sana nakikita nyo yung mga pagkakaiba. Meron diyang may mga restriction kumbaga. Sa National Forest, inaalaw yung commercial logging. Pero pagdating sa National Wildlife Refuge, hindi na inaalaw yung commercial activities pero inaalaw pa din yung recreational hunting and fishing at the same. Now we have the concept of anthropocentrism and ecocentrism. Dalawang konsepto yan in environmental science na dapat alam natin. Anthropocentrism is human-centered philosophy that protects and promotes of human interests or well-being at the expense of all other factors. Biggest advocate daw ay si Gifford Pinchot, the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service. From the word anthro, which means human, di ba? Human-centered ang anthropocentrism. Ito, ang pinangangalagaan dito, yung kumbaga yung advocacy dito, yung philosophy, to protect and promote human interest or well-being at the expense of all other factors. Dito sa image na nakikita natin, sa anthropocentrism, yung tao ang sa top, 'di ba? Siya ang center. Sa ecocentrism naman is a nature-centered, okay? Philosophy that places intrinsic value on the ecosystem regardless of their usefulness to human. Useful or unuseful to human. Kumbaga, tingnan nyo yung representation niya. We belong to kumbaga same level. There is no hierarchy. Nature-centered and we also belong to the nature. Okay, so that is ecocentrism. Nakasentro siya sa nature. So, alin ba ang mas gusto nyong i-promote na philosophy dyan? Or wala kayong gustong i-promote? Take a look at it. Construction of dam began in 1914. It is still in use today. Gifford Pinochet summarized his environmental ethic and decision making as. Ito yung sabi niya. Where conflicting interests must be reconciled, the questions shall always be answered from the standpoint of the greatest good of the greatest number in the long run. So, di ba, si Gifford Pinochet, siya yung um, proponent nung anthropocentrism. Sabi niya, where conflicting interests must be reconciled, the question shall always be answered from the standpoint of the greatest good of the greatest number in the long run. Kaya, ang iniisip niya, yung greatest good of the greatest number in the long run. And that is human. Yan yung philosophy niya. Conservationists during the progressive era were the most concerned about resource depletion. So ito na, during the progressive era, they categorized natural resources into 4 groups. Tingnan niyo po ha, please take note of this. Yung mga conservationists during the progressive era. Sa progressive era kasi, meron na tayong madaming mga technologies na nagagamit. Okay, so dahil doon sa pa-advance na tayo ng pa-advance kasi nga progressing tayo, there is really a high tendency of resource depletion since the demand keeps on increasing. So, ito yung categories ng natural resources. Inexhaustible resources cannot be used up. Hindi siya pwedeng kumaga mauubos. Inexhaustible kasi. Renewable resources can be replaced. Itong una, parang unlimited siya. cannot be used up, hindi siya mauubos. Example, yung sunlight. Renewable resources can be replaced but the process may take a long time. Mare-renew siya, mapapalitan siya, pero yung pagpalit sa kanya ay medyo pwedeng matagalan. Example, yung timber, yung soil. Pag pinutol mo yung kahoy, pwede siyang mapalitan but it will take a lot of time or a long time, like 20 years para mabalik yung malalaking puno. Same po yung soil. Non-renewable resources are consumed faster than they replenish as their formation took million years. Ay, lalo na to na non-renewable. Nakukonsume ng mabilis than they are replenished. Actually, pwede nga non-renewable, hindi mare-replenish eh. Pero kung mare-replenish man siya, it will take millions of years. Example, yung coal, yung oil, and natural gas. Yung coal na ito ay organic, meaning na-form talaga siya naturally. Hindi po yan yung coal na uling na binibili natin. Hindi po yan. Iba yung coal, yung fossil fuels po ito, from fossil fuels. Recyclable, non-renewable resources, this is the fourth category, also are not replaced at the rate they are used but can be used more than once. Ito naman, recyclable, non-renewable. Hindi siya na hindi siya nare-replace ng gano'n kabilis kasi nga non-renewable pero pwede nating magamit siya more than once. Example, iron, aluminum, copper. Kasi halimbawa may mga 'di ba binibili yan sa mga junk kasi mapapakinabangan pa yan in other products. Okay, so let's have the modern environmentalism. A series of major environmental disasters through the early 20th century raised awareness of many other environmental issues beside resource conservation. Ito naman yung sa modern environmentalism, a series of environmental disasters through the early 20th century raised awareness of many environmental issues besides resource conservation. Dati kasi parang yung takot natin ay maubos yung mga resources. Pero isa sa naging concern ng mga modern environmentalism ay hindi na lang po yung pag-conserve or pag-preserve ng mga resources. Ano pa? Ano pa yung naging concern? Yung mga disasters na na-experience natin ngayon. That is also because of harming our environment. Okay? So, tingnan nyo po in our topic about environmental science, we are dealing all about the interaction of human to our environment. That's why we are raising this kind of issues sa beginning pa lang ng lessons natin. Okay? Kasi yun yung pinaka-importante eh. Ano yung, kumbaga, ano yung direkta na impact mo sa environment, ginagawa mo na nakakatulong ba o nakaka-harm pa. Okay? So dito sa PowerPoint na ginagamit natin, stated here, in 1935, cane toads were introduced into Australia to help control the greyback cane beetle, a pest insect destroying sugar crops. Diba? Na ito yung mga cane toads. The toads became an invasive species, overpopulating in its new environment and outcompeting or harming native species. This is one problem po in our environment. The invasive species. Nagkakaroon ng invasion. Kumbaga, parang parang nananakop ba yung dating. Pero, tignan nyo yung una. Yung unang purpose sana is to help control the grayback cane beetle, a pest insect destroying cane crops in Australia. Kaya nila inintroduce sa Australia. itong invasive species. This is foreign or not, kumbaga hindi talaga siya taga doon sa lugar. Kaya lang, what happened? The toads became an invasive species, overpopulating in its new environment and outcompeting or harming native species. Yung first purpose na sana siya ay mag-control lang ng mga pest, yung mga grayback cane battle. Ang nangyari ay nagkaroon ng invasion. Mas nag-ano sila, kumbaga reproduce ng mabilis kaya nagkaroon ng overpopulation sa mga toads na ito. At since hindi naman talaga sila taga diyan sa lugar na 'yan, ano sila naha-harm nila yung ibang mga species. Yung supposed to be na kakainin lang dapat nilang pest, nakain na nila, maybe na-consume na nila, they will look for another source na puwede nilang makain. Eh, ito invasive, hindi ito wala pa sigurong, kumbaga magba-balance sa ecosystem dito sa Australia ng ganitong uri ng species. Kaya mas naging madali para sa kanila mag-reproduce. So, naging problema siya, okey? So, that is an example po ng environmental problem, the invasion of foreign species or ano 'to, invasive species. Another is a dense smog from a zinc plant in Donora, Pennsylvania in 1948 sickened thousands. This was one of the deadliest incident of air pollution. The introduction of particles or gases into the atmosphere that are harmful to living organisms. Okay, that is another environmental problem on air pollution. Sino ang ha-harm? Living organism, hindi lang tao. Tayo yung pinakaapektado. Pero kung titignan mo pa yung iba pang living organisms, like for example, the plants, they are also dependent to the air. Kailangan nila ng carbon dioxide, pero hindi nila kailangan ah, ng kumbaga ganito smog na kasi 'to, eh, napakadami na 'to and even to them, kumbaga it becomes harmful. Another example, radioactive fallout. This is, I think, is much uh, dangerous or more dangerous rather. Okay, radioactive fallout from nuclear bomb testing in the Marshall Island exposed native islanders and Navy sailors to radioactive fallout. So tingnan nyo, sino na naman ang na-harm? Di ba tao din? Sinong gumawa? Tao din naman. Okay? So this material was carcinogenic, meaning it increased the risk of cancer. Kapag carcinogenic, yun, radioactive yun eh, radiation yan eh. Ito ang mga examples natin ng mga environmental disasters. A major oil spill near the city of Santa Barbara in 1968 coupled a fire on the Cuyahoga River that same year left powerful images of the effects of water pollution. So sa water naman, from species to air to water, halos lahat na na ano natin, naha-harm. The contamination of lakes, rivers, oceans, and groundwater. And it will take a long time to to replenish or parang to return to its original state. What else? Rachel Carson published the book Silent Spring in 1962, documenting the effects that discriminate spraying of pesticides like DDT were having on the environment. Yan, mga DDT, mga pesticide. Many of these pesticides were persistent pollutants, meaning they resist normal environmental degradation. Hindi sila nadidegrade. So it stay on our environment. In our atmosphere, pollutants yan eh. And pwedeng pumunta pa yan doon sa taas. To add sa mga pollutants na nasa sa mga greenhouse gases, dagdag pa yan. Diba? Biodegradable pollutants will decompose over time. Many species, such as the whooping crane, nearly disappeared completely from the wild due to overhunting and habitat loss. And that leads to extinction. This raised awareness of the problem of extinction, where species disappears from Earth completely. Pag nag-extinct na, wala ka nang makikita ni isa mang species na ah, na mag-exist pa. Meron tayong mga specific topic. Ano lang 'to, kumbaga overview lang. Meron tayong mga specific topic dito sa subject natin na i-discuss natin yung extinction. Bago maging extinct, meron muna yung level eh. In the IUCN list, bago maging extinct, meron namang level na endanger muna siya or vulnerable muna siya. Kaya nga, sa ngayon, yung mga soon to be extinct, tina-try yung best na mai-reproduce sila. Okay? Meron ngang example ng ano, yung elephant. Kalimutan ko yung pangalan. Dalawa na lang sila. It's a male and a female. Elephant yun. Nasa species yun ng elephant. Dalawa na lang sila. Kaya lang, ang nangyari, namatay. Namatay na yung isa. So, to be extinct na yun. Kasi yung namatay pa, ang alam ko yung namatay yung babae. So, it cannot reproduce na. We know naman that it is the female sa karamihan, although not all, there are species na lalaki na nag na na kumbaga ang nanganganak, nagre-reproduce, merong gano'ng species pala, 'yan. So, because of this, because of overhunting and habitat loss, it leads to extinction. The complete disappearance of this kind of species. Extinction is a normal process with a background extinction rate of 1 to 5 species per year. The current rates of extinction are 1,000 to 10,000 times that. Tingnan nyo naman. Extinction lowers the biodiversity. Of course, alam naman natin na ang biodiversity is the diversity of biological uh, kumbaga biological aspects ng ating planet, yung may life. So, pag pababa ng pababa, nag-extinct, so it lowers the biodiversity or the amount of variation of species and genes within an area. Okay? So, yun yung mga nangyayari. Ano yung mga consequences pinapakita natin. Rapid increases in the population size of countries like India and China caused fears of human overpopulation and famine and extreme scarcity of food. One prediction from the book, The Population Bomb, the battle to feed all of the humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash program embarked upon now. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate. Tingnan niyo naman kung klaseng prediction ito, the population. Okay? Because of overpopulation. Bakit? Pag overpopulation ba, ibig sabihin dumadami ng dumadami tayo? Opo, that is true. Pero madami din po ang increase sa death. Why? For what reason? Mas masaklap ang death nila. Scarcity of food. tignan niyo yung cover page. While you are reading these words, 4 people will have died from starvation. Most of them are children. And that is true. There are places in the planet na ang kinakain na nila ano na, dahon, um, yung clay, yung anong tawag sa atin, putik na mismo, yung putik, the clay cookies. Kung napanood niyo na yung documentary nun. Yung putik mismo, pinapatuyo nila tapos gagawing parang cookies, yung malambot pa na clay gagawing parang cookies tapos ibibilad. 'Pag natuyo na, kakainin na nila. Eh, soil yun, eh, clay yun, eh. So, yun. So, most probably, they will not grow na malulusog. Kumbaga to ano lang yun, to add life to them kasi nasa-satisfy yung need ng body, but the span of life will be shortened. Kasi hindi naman dapat yun ang kanilang kainin, right? In 1978, homes in the City of Love Canal, New York, were abandoned due to leakage from a massive chemical waste dump near the elementary school. Imagine that. Massive chemical waste dump near the elementary school. Elementary school, may mga bata dyan eh. This was hazardous waste, compounds that are especially dangerous to the environment and human health. So, kung napansin niyo sa mga minention natin, nakita natin sa mga pictures, mga examples natin, these are all problems we encounter with our interaction to environment. So, nagkaroon tayo, whether we accept it or not, na-embrace yung anthropocentrism, wherein naka-center tayo sa needs ng tao. Anthropocentrism. Ayaw man natin i-accept na ganun. Pero yun po talaga yung kumbaga reality check. However, meron pa din namang mga tao na ecocentric or they put the nature in the center of it. Tama naman yon. Actually, kung ako, personally, I want to love both philosophy. Kasi yung totoo, people, yung tao, are given the dominion over other things. Kasi nga, di ba, tayo yung nasa peak, highest of all species. So, actually, we have the right doon sa mga other organisms. Yung right na hindi natin sila naman, kumbaga, mai-exploit ng ng ganon. Kaya nga, we are also, we should also be responsible once we consume these resources na nakukuha natin. Because we are really dependent on our environment. We cannot survive without our environment. Remember, we are consumers. We rely on the meat from animals na kinakain natin, meat of fishes from the fishes. Yung lahat ng mga materials na ginagamit natin are actually came from our environment. So we are really dependent on it. Huwag lang mangyari na maging over and unsustainable. Yun ang magiging main main agenda sa lahat ng topic natin sa environmental science. Okay, that's why we have the laws and regulation. Series of laws were passed in response to the modern environmentalism movement. Number one is the Safe Drinking Water Act, which regulates the testing of contents of municipal tap water. Safe Drinking Water Act. The Clean Water Act, which restrict pollution of surface water. The Clean Air Act, which restricts pollution of the atmosphere. What else? the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which describe rules for handling toxic and hazardous waste, and the Endangered Species Act, which lists species at risk for extinction and plans for their recovery, and the EPA, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, which is charged with enforcing these and other laws. These um, s- laws and regulation may be only applied, itong mga specific na to, in the United States. Pero lahat ng bansa ay merong mga sariling ganyan. Iba-iba lang po siguro yung version or yung title ng mga batas na ito. For example, sa Pilipinas, iba. So, ito na 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 yan. From Safe Drinking Water Act to EPA, hahanapan nyo po yan ng counterpart na mga batas na pinatutupad dito sa Pilipinas. Yan po yung activity po na gagawin ninyo. 6 lang naman. Safe Drinking Water Act in the Philippines. Ano yung batas na ipinatutupad sa atin para alam natin kung meron nga o wala? Ano yung batas na pinatutupad na nagre-regulate din sa testing of and contents of municipal tap water? Meron bang Water Act na magpo-protect noon sa atin? Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, and the Environmental Protection Agency. Okay, so 6 yan na hahanapan nyo ng counterpart ng mga batas dito sa Pilipinas. Isusulat nyo yung kung anong mga RA, Republic Act 9003 for example, for the Solid Waste Segregation Policy, mga ganon. Okay, pero yung mga counterpart lang po nitong 6 na ito. Copy po ba? Okay, sana nakuha po ninyo and your outputs will be submitted in our online platform. Global environmentalism. Many of those some environmental issues persist today, but are increasingly complex to deal because they are spread throughout the entire world, not just a single country. Oo, this is true. Global na. Dati yung problema sa isang country lang, pero ngayon, kumakalat na. Example natin, yung climate change is a global problem. Biodiversity is also a global problem na din. Okay? Environmental indicators are used to describe and evaluate the health of Earth's ecosystem. Meron tayong environmental indicators. Biodiversity, food production rates, climate change, human population growth, resource depletion. Another concept I want to add is the demographic divide. The countries are classified into one of two categories based on their economic status. We have the developed and the developing countries. Ito yung demographic divide. Depende po ito sa economic status. Developed countries tend to be wealthier, mas mayaman, have higher rates of education, advanced infrastructure, and an overall better standard of living compared sa mga developing countries. And I believe na nandito pa lang ang Pilipinas. Countries tend to be poorer, less education, have inadequate infrastructure, and a lower standard of living. Nasa developing countries pa lang tayo. Totoo naman yon sa list. Ang mga developed countries, mga European countries, United States of America, Australia, those are examples of developed countries. Mapapansin nyo naman yon sa kanilang mga technologies present, sa rates of education, and the overall standard of living. Okay? Pero yung developing, of course, developing wala naman tayong other way. We want to keep on we want to improve, right? That's the term. We want to improve, we want to progress. Kaya developing kasi siguro kung ma-maintain natin at mako-continue natin yung kumbaga yung pino-pursue na must develop to attain the developed category or classification, we hope na nagde-develop nga tayo pero hindi naman nada-damage ang ating environment. Ah, Kantahin niyo na lang yung kanta na ng asin na kapaligiran. Yan, magandang ano yun, magandang example yun ng environmental song kasi yun, eh. Significant difference include gross domestic product per capita or the GDP, a measure of the monetary value of the goods and services produced per person. So, pag GDP ang pinag-uusapan, higher in developed countries, lower in developing. Pag total fertility rates, the number of children born to an average woman, pag fertility rates, yung mga nabubuhay, mga bagong panganak, mataas yan sa developing. Kagaya sa atin, mabilis yung reproduction. Lower siya sa developed countries. Pagdating naman sa life expectancy, the number of years average person will live higher sa developed, lower in developing. Mababa daw ang life expectancy sa atin. Environmental regulations and worker protection tend to be weaker, unenforced, or non-existent in developing countries. Tingnan niyo po the environmental regulation and worker protection tend to be weaker, unenforced, pwedeng wala, non-existent in developing countries. Kumbaga, kung nga poorer tayo, kulang ang mga infrastructure natin, pati yung education din, ano din yun, possible reason din yun, kulang ang ano natin sa environmental regulation. Kaya ano yung mga nangyayari? While developed countries have a slower population growth, they have much higher rate of consumption, the rate of use of natural resources. Tingnan niyo po. Tayo na nga yung poorer, kumbaga tayo pa din yung kumbaga masyado pa tayong kumbaga ano yan? Yung parang in layman's term, tayo pa yung naapi. Mahirap na nga, parang ganun pa, aping-api. Economic principles has huge influence in environmental decision making. Supply and demand predicts that the cost of a resource such as oil will increase when demand is high or supply is low. Cost-benefit analysis is used by the government and companies to determine whether the benefit of doing something justify its economic cost. Many companies use labor in developing countries as a way to reduce their own cost of production and the final price tag of their product. So, ganun yun. Lalo na talaga sa developing countries. Way to reduce their own cost. And these workers pa, tingnan nyo, in these countries, doon sa mga developing countries often face dangerous working condition. These are hidden costs, not reflected in what we pay for the item. Kasi nga, como developing, sinabi na natin kanina, wala yung mga strict compliance sa mga environmental regulations. Kaya anong pwedeng mangyari? Accident at a pesticide factory located near the town of Bhopal, India. The plant was built in 1969 to produce a pesticide at a reduced cost. Cheaper labor, fewer environmental and worker safety regulations and inspection. A less expensive chemical process that used an intermediate chemical called methyl icosapentaene was used. Demand for the pesticide decreased in the 1980s and the supply increased, leading to the accumulation of IMC in storage tank. Wala na, bumaba yung demand ang taas ng supply. Naka-store lang, which were filled past capacity. Sumobra pa. So ano nangyari? Water leaked into one of the storage tank, causing a reaction that led to 30 tons of IMC being vented directly into the atmosphere. Overproduction. Thousands of people died, hundreds of thousands of people and animals were sickened. Hospitals, which were heavily suffered by underqualified doctors, were overwhelmed. The government passed a law that allowed the Indian government to represent the entire affected population of Bhopal. So yun ang nangyari. Yan. So ito, sa i-discuss na lang natin ito in details doon sa mga specific topic on that. So now we have the environmental worldviews, a balance. There are three perspectives in how we should deal with issues of pollution, resource overconsumption, and loss of biodiversity. The planetary management worldwide takes the perspective that humans should manage the Earth's resources to achieve the maximum benefit. So ano daw po? The planetary management worldview takes the perspective that humans should manage the Earth's resources. Tayo pa din ang magmamanage nun. The stewardship worldview believes that humans should manage the Earth but in a more ethical and sustainable way. When we hear the word sustainable, ibig sabihin, we are consuming whatever we want, whatever we need, but without, ano yan, nakalimutan ko yung term. Ah, sustainable meaning, we can use, we can consume what we want without compromising. That's the term I am looking for. Without compromising the needs of the coming generation. Kumbaga, na-enjoy natin ngayon, na-consume natin ngayon, but we are not worried na yung darating na generation ay meron pa ding makukonsume. Meaning, sustainable. Ganun. And ethical. Makatao. Makakalikasan. Also, anthropocentric but with more of an emphasis on living such a way that human needs can be met indefinitely. This is called sustainability. Okay? Kasi hindi naman talaga mawawala ang pagiging anthropocentric natin. Kasi ang end goal natin is for the benefit of human being. Okay? Pero yung emphasis nga na nilalagay natin is to sustain. Okay? And be more ethical. The environmental wisdom worldview believes that we are totally dependent on the nature and should preserve nature as much as possible to maintain our own species. Ito naman yung isa pang worldview. We have the stewardship worldview. Meron din tayong environmental wisdom worldview that we are totally dependent. Ako, I agree, we are dependent on nature and should preserve nature as much as possible to maintain our own species. Kasi kapag hinarm natin ang environment, bumabalik sa atin, di ba? Pag natural na ang bumawi, natural disaster, tayong magagawa, no? Indispensable. Ano siya, kung mag-inevitable siya. An ecocentric worldview that emphasizes sustainable for all species. So, sustainability sa lahat talaga. Okay? So, each of these world views acknowledge that the Earth is a closed system, meaning matter does not enter or leave it in large amounts. Resources are finite, waste do not go away. This understanding form the basis for understanding and solving each of the issues within environmental science. So, closed system kasi ang Earth, diba? Pag closed system, ibig sabihin, kung ano yung nandyan, maybe nag-iiba lang siya ng form, pero nandyan pa din siya sa loob. Okay? Parang yung law of conservation of matter lang or ng energy. It is neither created nor destroyed, but only transform from one form to another. So, ganun yung nangyayari sa closed system. Does not enter or leave, nandun lang siya. Resources are finite. Pag sinabi nating finite, di ba may infinite? Ano bang ibig sabihin ng infinity? Di ba parang unlimited? Pero pag finite, finite or kung paano man basahin yan, may limitation. Tapos, waste do not go away. Nasa closed system lang siya. That's why we have to address these problems. The understanding form, this understanding form the basis for understanding and solving each of the issues within environmental science. So yun muna ang mga iiwan ko sa inyo ideas. We will discuss na overview lang kasi ito eh. We have specific topics na mapag-uusapan natin ito in detail. You have the copy of your syllabus. You can check on it para alam nyo na kung ano yung mga susunod nating mga pag-usap-usapan regarding the environmental, regarding to the interaction of human being in the environment. With that, I conclude our discussion. Thank you so much for your listening. This is Ma'am Syra signing out. Thank you so much.